Irish Nation, Notre Dame with another take care of business. Really boring week in college football for Notre Dame fans, but boring is good when you beat a team that was in the playoff a year ago, taking care of business against Florida State 52-3, an absolute dismantling. Mike, how's your weekend been, and what's your quick reaction to the game?
Weekend was great. Game was boring, as you mentioned, which I think is a good spot to be in when you're playing a team like Florida State that's had a horrific year. This was actually their worst loss in history, tied for the worst loss. They've had two other games that have had a margin of loss this big. So that just tells you how thorough a dismantling it was. I think the camera crew, they were really not doing Norvell any favors. It felt like every couple minutes they were just panning over, doing a close up on his face, and just showing how dejected he looked. So yeah, not fun times for Florida State. I think this game, we both expected a blowout coming into this game, but Notre Dame exceeded those expectations. As we mentioned, it was a 52-3 margin, one of tied for the biggest loss in Florida State history. And I think our defense in particular was outstanding here. I think, as we've seen throughout this year, in the opening drive, we will give up some yardage. We'll allow the offense to. It seems like we give them a little room to operate as we figure out what they're doing, and then once we make adjustments, then we lock in, and that's exactly what happened here. So they got a field goal on that opening drive, but after that, it was just a complete lights out performance from the defense.
Absolutely. So before we get into a little bit more about that game, stepping back here on the show, a pretty simple show today. We're going to go through the Florida State game. We're going to look ahead to UVA, another matchup where Notre Dame's expected to be a big favorite. Recurring theme here is Notre Dame hits what I'd call just the average part of the schedule. And it feels a little bit like the doldrums where, ND just has not really had a big time matchup, really from Louisville all the way to USC. And it's all about taking care of business in between. And so far, so good for Freeman on that department here, really ever since the NIU game. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time here with a few weeks to go on looking at college football playoff scenarios with 3 regular season games to go. Where's Notre Dame in the picture? Of course, the first polls came out last week. There will be another shakeup here this week with some chaos, maybe not as much as ND fans would have liked, but where is Notre Dame in that picture now? Where are we with getting in? Can we lose to USC, or is this truly just a run the table scenario? What are the odds of a home game? And what should Notre Dame fans be cheering for? There's not that many games left that are really going to make a big impact on Notre Dame's playoff picture. Of course, for these other teams, there's a lot of like win and you're in scenarios for Colorado or for Miami or for SMU. But for Notre Dame's perspective, a lot of those are just, well, one team will win and get in and one team will lose and, we'll be out. And they're pretty binary. But in terms of actual chaos moving Notre Dame up, actual games that will impact the seeding, just a few data points. And I think there's some clear pictures. It's all a little murky, but clear pictures of what Notre Dame fans should be cheering for. So looking forward to that section to wrap up. Diving back into this Florida State game, though, that's, of course, the place to start. Mike, you said it on the defense. Florida State only had a 31% success rate in this game. We generated a 27% havoc rate. Again, offenses want to be in the mid 40s, so closer to every other play. Offense wants to be staying on schedule, getting most of the yards they need on first down, the majority of the yards they need on second down, converting on third down. Florida State was just doing that 1 in 3 plays. And when they weren't successful, we were highly disruptive. Offenses want to have those disruptive plays maybe 10 to 15% of the time. Notre Dame was almost double that, led by 8 sacks on 18 quarterback pressure. So I thought that was the biggest part of this game, is not only were we getting pressure, we were getting that quarterback on the ground. And that was 18 QB pressures on 39 dropbacks. So just about every time one of the Florida State quarterbacks was going back to pass, we were all over them. So I think a 50% pressure rate, 50% of those converting into sacks, just lights out stuff by the defensive line of Notre Dame. I thought the best unit on either side of the ball. What else stood out to you about the defense? Clearly, that was the big headline, but what else do you think, is kind of the stat behind the stat that really showed how dominating this was to give up just 3 points?
I mean, I think you hinted at a bunch of it, but just in terms of the yardage that they got in the passing game, this is, I think, in terms of passing yardage, this is some of the lowest yards per attempt that I've seen. So their quarterbacks combined to complete 39% of their throws. Obviously, that's abysmal, but just 3.4 yards per attempt. And then the two interceptions on top of that. So we keep mentioning how great our secondary is, and they continue to show that. That's exactly what we showed here. And then on top of that, our pass rush was getting home. So we weren't really giving them any separation at all in the passing game. And then on top of that, we were pressuring them nonstop and then landing those pressures as well and converting them to sacks. So when you do that, it's going to be impossible to really do anything in the passing game, and that's exactly what we saw. Granted, Florida State, their offense has been a big time struggle this year, particularly in the passing game. But even considering that, I think this was our defense showing how elite they are, particularly in the passing game. I thought just a few other people to call out here. I thought the NBC booth, they did a good job calling out the players who were really impactful. I agreed with the people that they were calling out. Granted, I think it was a little easier to call some of these people out because they were really flying off the screen in terms of some of the impactful plays they were doing. Riley Mills, you got to start with him. 3 sacks, just extremely disruptive, looking like honestly like a future NFL defensive lineman. Donovan Heinisch, good to see the younger brother of Kurt Heinisch making an impact here. He had 2 as well. Unfortunately, he got more playing time because Howard Cross was hurt. We'll mention that a bit later, but it seems like he's okay. He had a sprained ankle, but it sounds like he's hopefully not going to miss any extended time. Christian Gray, I talked about the secondary, wasn't even targeted. So good to see him step up. And then, Leonard Moore, I think I want to call him out as well. I thought he did a great job here. He's only targeted once for 8 yards. True freshman, stepping up and, getting more meaningful playing time. As we mentioned with him before, he's obviously not playing at a Ben Morrison level, but he's playing at a really high level, especially for a freshman. And he definitely is playing like he belongs. And if he keeps playing like this, I'm just continuing to be more and more impressed with him and continuing to really believe in the fact that he's going to be a big time impact player for us down the line. And Brett, I don't know if there are any other guys that you want to call out here, but those guys there that I mentioned, those were the ones that were top of my list.
I was definitely thinking Christian Gray and Leonard Moore. I was going to throw Xavier Watts, Aiden Schuler, and Jordan Clark, the safeties, into that same bucket. Jordan Clark, of course, with the interception. But if you look at our 5 starting defensive backs when we're in our nickel package, it's those 3 safeties, Christian Gray and Leonard Moore. They combined to be targeted just 3 times, giving up 2 catches for 22 yards. That's absurd when the starting secondary only gives up 22 yards passing when they're in coverage. What that basically means is the only success that Florida State got in the passing game was check downs or tight ends against linebackers or kind of extended plays, but just like nothing consistently going in kind of the traditional passing game going against our secondary. I don't care how much struggle Florida State's had this year. When you hold their starting quarterback to 51 yards passing and only 22 yards through your starting secondary, what a performance. Flipping to the offense, this was somehow a mixed bag in the advanced stats, despite scoring 52 points. Normally, when you score 52 points, everything on offense looks great. Your success rate looks great. Your havoc allowed looks great. Your explosiveness looked great. Like everything is just like off the charts to go score 52 points. And it helps when, we forced a couple turnovers. We put our team in some good field position, et cetera. But it was pretty shaky. Like we had, I think, 3 or 4 drives in this game that were 3 and outs. I know we had 2 back to back, and I thought we had another one where we maybe picked up 1 first down on 1st and 10, and then immediately next 3. So it wasn't quite a 3 and out, but a 4-play drive and punt. And so it had some fits and starts. Now, some of these metrics here are also going to be brought down by the fact that pretty much the second half of the third quarter and the entire fourth quarter, when Notre Dame really poured it on and I think tacked on another like 24 points, none of that counts in the advanced stats because it was garbage time. So the stats here for Notre Dame really stopped at 28-3. And so I think that also kind of held back some of the stats. But before getting into those, really the big one is the success rate was 37%. Like offenses want to be in the mid to high 40s. We were at 37%. We noted how kind of abysmal Florida State was at 31%. We weren't that much successful. And we noted how our defense was completely disrupting Florida State with a 27% havoc rate. Well, they had a 22% havoc rate. They stuffed a number of our runs. They had 4 deflected or batted down passes. They had a couple of sacks. Like, it was very disruptive. And I think normally if you combine a 37% success rate and give up 22% havoc to the defense, I would tell you, gosh, that's probably a long day for the offense. Like, I would tell you, like, that is all signs of trouble. Yet we really won this game with explosiveness. We'll get into the passing game in a second, but 8 different players from Notre Dame had at least one play of 15 yards or more. We had 10 overall. That included a 65-yard touchdown highlight by Jadarian Price. Like, just a lot of big plays that was really the difference. But this was not kind of play-by-play domination. This was big play after big play after big play with kind of fits and starts in between. So with that as the advanced stats backdrop, that maybe not quite as dominating as a game as 52 points suggests, at least for our offense. Mike, what was the narrative? And I think what was the narrative, especially around Riley Leonard, who we were texting before this. I think both thought he played a great game, but a stat line that might not suggest he played a great game. Like, how do we parse that out in the game?
Yeah, I think if you look at his stat line, you would say, all right, he played fine. But then if you go back and dive into the stats a little bit more and then look at some of these incompletions that he had, particularly the drops, I think it paints a completely different picture. So I'll start with his rushing, because we know Riley Leonard is always a great runner, and I would say this was even as great of a runner as he is. This was one of his better games on the ground, I thought too. He was very effective, excluding sacks. He had 80 yards rushing and 2 scores on the ground. So he showed up on the ground. But the one area where I mentioned where if you just looked at his stats, it wouldn't be entirely clear to you how well that he played was in the passing game. So his passing stats were very explosive. Brett, you mentioned how critical the explosiveness was in this game. And that was both the run game and the passing game. So with Leonard, he had these explosive plays, but his completion percentage, if you just look at it quick glance, was not what you would necessarily expect. But we had 4 big time drops, and there were a couple other ones that you could maybe argue could have been counted as drops as well. And when I rewatched these, they weren't perfect throws, but they were certainly good enough throws to where the receiver should have had them.
And some of them were. I mean,
Yeah,
Jeremiah Love. I mean, it hit the number 4. Like
yes,
like the
yes.
ball caught him and somehow didn't just hold it.
And some of these would have been big
Big
time,
time
like big
games.
yardage plays. Yeah. So I think it's like his stat line was fine. If you don't even consider these drops, but when you factor these in, I think we left a lot of yards on the table. I think his stats had the opportunity to be a lot better here. So he had a 52% completion rate. You see that, you're not impressed. But if you adjust it for these drop passes, it's a 72% adjusted completion percentage. Then on top of that, you would add a whole lot of yardage there too. And it's worth noting, Riley Leonard graded out extremely well in this game. So I believe he had like another over 90 Pro Football Focus grade performance, that's just very elite. And his grade in both the run and the pass was very high. So he was getting it done from a watching the film grading him standpoint. He was getting it done on the run and the pass. And the opportunities for him to get bigger plays, like when that didn't happen, basically the evaluators were saying it wasn't on him. It was more on the players around him. So the big thing here is that we're continuing to see Riley Leonard develop as a passer. It wasn't, again, if you just look at the stats, it wouldn't be immediately apparent. But if you really break down what happened, he's looking more and more confident. He's making the right reads. He's pushing the ball more and more downfield. I think his average depth of target was, right here. Its average depth of target was 13 yards. So by far his longest depth of throw on the season. He graded out particularly well on throws that had an average depth of target 10 plus yards. So we're seeing that I think the rust is finally off. So I think we're seeing a quarterback that's comfortable playing again at this level. He's healthy. I think he's getting more and more comfortable with Mike Denbrock's system. And this was, I mentioned this to you, Brett. I think this is the only game so far where I thought our receivers and the supporting cast was holding Riley Leonard back. I thought I thought that like there was another gear for this offense, and it was Riley Leonard had his foot on the throttle, and it was everyone else who's kind of holding them back a little bit. So I think, and I think that's also a bit of a microcosm for the offense as a whole. This game, I think it wasn't a bad performance, but it was mixed, as you said. I think we also, when you win by a margin that we won by, I don't think you could say it's a bad performance, but I think it's we had an opportunity to have a cleaner performance for sure, and not really have anything to nitpick. But we just didn't totally capitalize on all these opportunities. We capitalized on plenty, right? We had a lot of explosive plays, but there were certainly opportunities that we had that we didn't fully capture.
It's interesting that you could easily nitpick this into concerns or wow, like what if scenarios to be even better in this game. And so a couple of different ways to look at that. I think we got to start being concerned about Jeremiah Love a little bit. This is now the third time in the last 5 games where he hasn't topped 3.1 yards per carry or 35 yards rushing. And I know we want to keep talking about, hey, he scored a touchdown in every game this year and he has 10 touchdowns. It's a little misleading. Like, that's a little misleading now when, his big time stat games have really come against Purdue and Navy and Stanford. And outside of that, like, it's kind of been a slog, and he's still, forcing missed tackles. And like, I think he's, doing a pretty decent job in the yards after contact category, but like not really in this game. 9 carries for 19 yards. And I can also chalk that up to, it was just very clear very early on that Florida State said, we are going to put 7, 8 guys in the box and make Riley Leonard beat us. And I think Jeremiah Love has probably been facing that the last 4 or 5 games. I really think, it doesn't take a very obvious game film to know, hey, if you're going to get Notre Dame off schedule, it's making Riley Leonard beat you as a pocket passer. And so Florida State just said, we're going to make Riley Leonard beat us as a pocket passer. And he did. He sliced and diced him and was well on his way for 300 yards passing if you take out the drops, and, still went for 220, still had 80 yards on the ground, still, I think, accounted for 2 or 3 of the touchdowns. Like, so very clearly, Denbrock and Riley Leonard gave us what the defense allowed. But I think there's a concern in there where a combination of our offensive line and Jeremiah Love aren't totally getting things going on a consistent basis. Now, we haven't needed to. There's also an element of like, Jeremiah Love hasn't ran the ball for more than 11 times since the opener. Like, it's not like he's out there getting 15, 20 yards a carry like Audric Estime did. Part of that's because we also have Jadarian Price, who's been popping. Like, he's been doing, really well. And so I think there's been a good lightning and thunder there. But I think some of the stats behind the stats, maybe a little concerning about Riley Leonard, is about Jeremiah Love. The other one that we've talked about that I think if Notre Dame looks way outclassed in a playoff game, and I'm not predicting that, by the way. We'll kind of get to that in some other segments throughout the year of kind of, is Notre Dame a contender? Will we be competitive in a playoff game? And the resounding answer in the data is, yeah, by all accounts, we should be. Notre Dame fans should feel very competitive going into these matchups. But the one Achilles heel that has not bit us yet is Riley Leonard under pressure. In this game, he was only under pressure at 26% of his dropbacks. So that's a really low rate. That's a great job by our offensive line protecting him. But on those 9 dropbacks where he was under pressure, he only got the ball off 5 times. So 4 times he's like scrambling or throwing it away, and he didn't scramble for any first downs. So it's not like he was scrambling with high efficiency. Like, it was scrambling to just, try to get out of there. And on those 9 dropbacks, only 5 attempts, only completed 1 pass. So 9 times under pressure, we only complete 1 pass for 15 yards. That is very low efficiency when under pressure. Yes, you expect a drop off, but that is like a cataclysmic drop off. And we've been highlighting that a ton this year. A ton. That is not new news about Riley Leonard. That is just Riley Leonard at this point, that if he is pressured, he does not do a good job stepping up in that pocket, continuing to get through his progressions and deliver a ball. It's a concern. So, like, yes, we won 52-3, but there's a couple recurring themes here that against good teams that can generate more pressure, against big teams where, like, you're going to need a 3rd down or 2 or 3 that you frankly maybe don't deserve, but you have a guy just elevate the team. Those are the type of stats you want to look to say, like, is Riley Leonard going to be that guy? And right now, if he's comfortable, he's looking great and he's getting through his reads. If he's under pressure, it's not happening. And so that's a thing I'm going to continue to watch for and see if he can deliver on. But it could be an Achilles heel at the wrong time, at the wrong place.
Yeah, agree. He has been improving a bit in this area, but the drop off is still pretty stark. I would say, like, one area that he was not doing as well earlier this season was against the blitz, and in this game he graded out very well against the blitz.
Mm-hmm.
So it seemed like he was making the proper reads, and again, that just points to continued development as a passer, continued development within the system. But I think the next step for him is under pressure. So it's, oh crap, okay, someone from the defensive line was able to get through. How do I how do I negate this? How do I make something out of nothing? And look, it's really tough when you're under pressure. Yeah, of course you're going to have a drop off, but the top quarterbacks in college football, that's where they show their worth, is that that's when they do they'll have a Caleb Williams. I mean, he was, say what you will about him this year in the NFL, but in college, I mean, that was an area that he excelled in. It's pressure, spins, and then he hits a receiver 30 yards downfield, and it's just a complete backbreaker. So I think Leonard does have the tools to continue to improve in this area, but something to monitor. And if he is able to improve, that actually that bodes very well for when we, assuming we make the playoff, that bodes very well for if we face an elite team at some point in the playoff.
I'm going to do this on the fly, and I just picked Quinn Ewers. I was like, I'm not going to go with Cam Ward winning the Heisman Trophy. I'm not going to go with whoever. I just said, who's another very, very good quarterback on a top 10 team. And Quinn Ewers was the first one that came to mind. And so I swear I'm doing this blind. I'm pulling up Pro Football Focus. I'm going to start on the season, Riley Leonard versus Quinn Ewers when under pressure. Riley Leonard, when under pressure, completes 35% of his throws for 2.7 yards per attempt, has 1 touchdown, 0 interceptions. When the pocket is clean, his completion percentage is 72%. His yards per attempt is 8.2. He's got 8 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. Quinn Ewers, very interestingly, when he's kept clean, completes 73.5% of his passes for 8.5 yards per attempt, has 16 touchdowns to 5 interceptions. So he's thrown the ball a lot more than Riley Leonard is, but his touchdown to interception ratio, his yards per attempt, and his completion percentage are all basically identical to Riley Leonard's. They're all very, very similar. But when under pressure, Quinn Ewers still completes 54% of his throws. So it drops off from 74%, but it's still 54% of his throws for 6.5 yards per attempt. He's completing almost twice as many throws for that's about almost 2.5 times as many yards per attempt as Riley Leonard. They're identical quarterbacks when not under pressure, and a massive gap emerges when he's under pressure. And I get it. Everyone would love to have Quinn Ewers. He's a first-round NFL draft pick. Like, he's a phenomenal quarterback. But that's the difference we're talking about. Like, Quinn Ewers has a chance to, go be one of the best quarterbacks in the playoff and really elevate his team as we've seen him now do throughout his career. This is a big stat where Riley Leonard doesn't do that. And I think it's just a big Achilles weakness. Maybe Quinn Ewers isn't the best example. Maybe I can go find someone else. But look, that's 2 quarterbacks on top 10 teams that are trying to be top 10 offenses. And it's where those 2 quarterbacks really kind of differentiate themselves.
Yeah. Look, and I mentioned we saw the exact same thing with Caleb Williams. Caleb Williams, his stats were phenomenal when he was under pressure. And it was actually, I don't really think Caleb Williams is unique, where I don't even think he had much of a drop off under pressure. I think there were some games where if you looked at his stats, he actually played better when he was under pressure. So he's kind of I'm going to throw a J.R. Smith reference here, but he claimed that he would shoot better when there was a hand in his face. So you had a little bit of that going on there with Caleb Williams. I'm going to have one other call out here just because we did a segment on this literally last week, but that's 4th down conversion, 4th down analytics, when to go for it. Again, this is definitely nitpicking, but we didn't go for it on a 4th and 3 scenario on the Florida State 47 in the second quarter. At that point, the score was 14-3, and we decided to punt. And this was a perfect scenario to go for it. The game was still in doubt. It wasn't clear that we were going to win at this point. I assumed that we would, just because Florida State's really bad. But it was kind of odd to me that we didn't go for it here when generally we have this year. So it's just, to me, it's a reminder that we need to continue to be aggressive in these scenarios. I don't know if this was a scenario where we kind of just took it for granted that we were going to be able to just put our foot on the gas and eventually close some space. But I think like, we can't really afford to do that. I think if there's an opportunity to get some more points, like, I think you can't just assume that. I think you gotta lean in. You can't take You know, you can't take like the opponent being weak for granted. I think you got to try to maximize points wherever possible. And then interestingly, later that quarter, we were in a very similar situation, and we did go for it on fourth down, and then lo and behold, we scored a touchdown on that drive.
In
So
fact,
just
we went for it on 4th and 2 and 4th and 10 on that drive.
yeah,
Which the 4th and 10 might have been a little bit of, wasn't sure if Mitch Jeter was healthy, and we ran him
yeah,
out, and then we called
yeah.
the timeout. So I get it, but we still, to your point, we didn't go for it on 4th and 3 at the 47, but we did go for it on 4th and 2 at the 44. Like, I think those just both got to be go for it calls. Absolutely. But hey, we were 2 for 2 on fourth down, and another example that, when we are aggressive, it's paying off this year. So let's move to the UVA game. This is a balanced but average team. So I think, unlike Florida State, that's a very average team in the SP plus, UVA is actually very similar. They're 69th in SP plus overall, but unlike having an atrocious offense and a pretty okay defense like Florida State, they're just very average in both. 65th in offense, 70th in defense. Their record is very average, 5-4. Blowout losses against Clemson and UNC, also lost in close games to Maryland and Louisville. They also now have a win against the 2-loss Pitt team that's been in the top 20 for a lot of the season. They scraped by Wake Forest and Boston College. So even in the games they're playing, it's like, look, they can go and be really competitive against a Louisville team, really competitive against the Pitt team, but then play down to Wake Forest and Boston College. So, like, they're not blowing the doors off of anyone, but they're generally keeping it close, other than back-to-back games against Clemson and UNC. So a below average Power 5 team, but if you look across all of college football, very similar ratings to Georgia Tech, Navy, Florida State. The other thing I'll say is they rank 61st in the talent composite. That means they just have 8 four-star players on their roster, and really only 2 of them are meaningfully contributing. Both the wide receiver, Notre Dame fans know one of those, transfer Chris Tyree from Notre Dame, who is a former very high-end 4-star recruit, and injuries have kind of derailed his career. So even out of the high-end talent they have, those guys aren't the contributors. 6 of those 8 4-stars are underclassmen or were out with injuries or one reason or another, aren't actually on their 2-deep right now and playing a lot. And so a very average team, another scenario where Notre Dame is going to be heavy favorites, another game that I would expect to be boring for Notre Dame fans. That's okay. Right now, boring is great until we get to the season finale at USC. Mike, you want to take us through what's driving their offense? What is UVA trying to do to be successful? What's the blueprint look like?
Yeah, I'll start with the one area where they do excel, and so that's offensive line yards. So that's how much push they're getting. So in that, they actually rank 34th in the country. So their offensive line can actually generate a push in the run game. And then if you look at the Pro Football Focus grades, they grid out. This is where they're aligned. They grid out very well there too from a run blocking standpoint, 38th. So that's the one area where it seems like they can be effective. The pass game, on the other hand, has been a struggle. They're 92nd in explosiveness, 87th in passing game success rate. So they're generally not, they're not like converting a whole lot of successful plays. They're not staying on schedule, and then they're not making up for it with big time, big yardage plays. And their quarterback, Anthony Colandrea, underwhelming as you would expect with when you have advanced statistics like that in the passing game. 12 touchdowns, 8 interceptions. So not exactly a great ratio there. And then especially in recent weeks, they have shifted more to utilizing him in a more of a dink and dunk capacity. So in this case, his average depth of target, earlier this year we kept beating the drum about how Riley Leonard's average depth of target was very low, and that was something holding our offense back. We've since improved. For them, UVA they're stuck where Notre Dame was before, where the average depth of target is very low. So Colandrea, his average depth of target has been less than 7 yards in the past 4 games. So they're not really taking many shots downfield, which would also explain why their explosiveness is not very high. So nothing really to fear here in the passing game. Again, not very impressive. They do have some weapons if they can get going, but they really haven't been able to do that. I'll call out Malachi Fields. He leads the team with 665 yards, 15 yards per catch, 4 touchdowns. You already mentioned Chris Tyree. He's when healthy, he can be good, but it's not like he's like a top wide receiver at Ohio State, right? He's someone we should definitely be able to contain. And Chris Tyree is only averaging 5.6 yards per catch, so it's not like they're getting a whole lot out of him in this capacity. And I mentioned the 12 touchdowns, 8 interceptions. So inconsistency. I mean, you look at that stat line, you're not going to be surprised to see a whole lot of inconsistency throughout the year. 4 games with 2 interceptions, 4 games with 250 plus yards passing, but then 5 games with less than 180. So occasionally, like I mentioned, they can get it going, but that definitely has not been a theme this year. He did throw 300 for 280 yards against a solid Louisville defense, though. So again, there are some examples here where they've been able to look a little bit better than you would expect, but they haven't been able to do so consistently, and I would be very surprised if they were able to do that against a Notre Dame defense that's elite and is particularly good at shutting down the pass. I mentioned the run blocking, how much push they're getting. In terms of running backs, they have 2 backs here who've really been leading the charge. Both have about 400 between 420 and 450 yards. And Colandry also he's a dual threat, so he has some rushing yards here. So they're a three-headed monster in that capacity, but none of them are really dominating here. No one's really averaging more than 50 yards per game. So, and then none of them actually have more than 3 rushing touchdowns. So like I said, they can get it done in the run. A lot of that's driven by the offensive line generating the push. But I wouldn't say any of these backs or even the quarterback. None of them are a particularly scary run threat. Like you have to respect them for sure. They're solid players, but they're not someone. They're not. None of them are players that are going to completely break your defense's back. So I think, yeah, like we got to bring our A game when it comes to run defense. It's an area at times we've been a little bit spotty, but I think generally we've improved as the season has gone on. But I think that this is an area where we definitely need to lock in and not allow them to get it going in the run game.
Absolutely. I mean, and even, I think if there's one guy you mentioned, as I've just kind of been going through some stats here, that I think is kind of their big hit guy, it's Xavier Brown. They're kind of number 2 running back, although they're a little running back by committee. He definitely has a little bit more pop. He's running for over 6 yards attempt. He's a guy that, is, if there's explosiveness on this team, it's largely coming from him in the run game, and he's their guy leading the way in missed tackles forced. He's the guy kind of leading the way in their yards per carry to the outside. And so like he's the guy they're trying to get out into open space. But again, it's kind of been fits and starts, right? Like he's got 430 yards on the year and we're 9 games in. Like he's kind of averaging 45 yards a game. And it's just nothing has been consistent for UVA of kind of getting that passing game and running game going at the same time. As we look to their defense, I'll just keep using the word. It's very average. 70th in SP plus. They're 65th in success rate allowed. And then things start getting a little worse. They're 90th in explosiveness allowed. They're 85th in havoc generated. So they're okay about not letting teams just kind of march up and down the field on them, but they're not a big disruptive team. They have, they average about 2.5 sacks a game. They've gotten some turnovers. Last week against Pitt, they had 2 interceptions, but their pressure rate is actually on the lower end. They grade out at 98th in Pro Football Focus. And so a lot of times where they've been disruptive and getting things like turnovers and interceptions, it's more just bad quarterback play. It's not like they're consistently harassing the quarterback and forcing mistakes or forcing errors or forcing that havoc. And so this is, I think, a pretty susceptible team. The way I think about it for Notre Dame is they've gone up against 3 top 25 offenses, Clemson, Louisville, and UNC. 2 of those put up 40 plus points. And Notre Dame's offense in the SP plus is ranked better than any of those 3 teams. Even Louisville, they held them to 24 points in a winning effort for Louisville hung on in that game, or UVA beat Louisville? I can't even remember the outcome now. But even then, like in 2 of those 3 games against top 25 offenses, UVA just got completely torched by Clemson and UNC, and expecting something similar here. If there's one bright spot, their secondary is where 4 of their top 5 Pro Football Focus grades are among their defensive starters. 2 at safety, 1 at corner. I think Kempton Shine is a quarterback that could definitely shut down a number 1 receiver for the opposing team. He's averaging about 3 targets per game and is only allowing about 1 catch per game when targeted. Not sitting here saying he's Ben Morrison, but he's been able to kind of be a lockdown corner. Their 3 safeties are all top 5 on the team in tackles. So it's a really aggressive safety position, a very low missed tackle rate from those guys. that's also, though, showing it's susceptible defense if your safeties are your leading tacklers. That means other teams are getting to the second level, and those safeties are needing to make tackles because the defensive line and the linebackers didn't. So I think this defense is very gettable for Mike Denbrock. And I just think across the board, like, yeah, they do some things okay, but there's just not any part of this defense where I say, oh gosh, they're going to be able to take away blank from Notre Dame and make us one dimensional. They just haven't demonstrated that against good teams this year. They've been able to do that against a Boston College. They've been able to do that against a Wake Forest. They were able to do that against a Pittsburgh team last week, but I think Pittsburgh's offense is garbage and they were really overrated from a super weak schedule. So I'm not reading too much into that. I just think Notre Dame is an overwhelming matchup for this defense because we can beat you in so many different ways: running game, running back, and quarterback. And now our passing game really starting to hum here in recent weeks.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think a theme. I mean, this is honestly for both the offense and the defense. Is you mentioned average. I think that's the first theme that you want to hit on. But then two, inconsistent. So they're average, but then they're also inconsistent. You mentioned some of the how they've been disruptive in some spurts, but generally that hasn't been consistent. And you could attribute that to really the opposing offense making mistakes more than them being disruptive. So I think right, you honed in on their secondary. If there's a position group that you could say is more of a strength, but I think just based on the body of work that they put together as a whole, and I think also the way that our offense has developed as the season has gone on. I think perhaps if this was the first couple games in the season and Riley Leonard was still shaking off the rust, still uncomfortable in Denbrock's system, we haven't totally figured out what was working as effectively in the passing game. Maybe they would be able to slow us down, but I think where we're at right now, unless they're able to get a lot of pressure on us, which I don't think they're going to be able to in this game, I think Riley Leonard's going to be able to hopefully slice and dice them in this game. Now, I don't know if our receivers are going to be performing to the point to where we're just burning them constantly or anything like that. But I think we're going to be able to. I think we're going to be able to get some productivity out of the passing game, and our run game has been effective more consistently this year. So I think we'll continue to see that. So yeah, I'm with you, Brett. I don't think this defense is going to be able to do a whole lot to limit our offense. Florida State this past weekend, we called out, they were actually as bad as Florida State is. Their defense per SP plus was still in the 30s, so it's very much what you could consider a pretty good defense. That's not the case with UVA. It's a much bigger drop off. They're closer to 70. So I think if we bring our A game, we play aggressive, don't take anything for granted, and Riley Leonard keeps playing the way that he has been playing and even progresses, I think that we'll be able to definitely put up some points here on them. And then just one thing I'm going to add here is Louisville did actually, they beat
Yeah,
UVA. The score was
I just
24-20.
pulled that up too. Yep.
Yeah. So with that, I'm going to get into the score predictions. Brett, I'm going to call out some of the key stats we like to point out before we get into the score predictions. So SP plus implies that Notre Dame is about a 28-point favorite. So very similar to Florida State, actually. Although the key difference being here is that UVA is more balanced in the fact that they're just average in both as opposed to kind of good in one and then really bad in the other, like Florida State. Opening Vegas line says it's about 22 and a half points right now. ESPN says that Notre Dame wins this one about 96% of the time. So I think we hinted at all this as we were talking about UVA, but I think our team is surging right now. I think we're playing our best ball at the right time. Our offenses, it seems like we still have areas to improve as we called out, but I think that we're continuing to figure things out on offense, and we're hitting more of that potential that we had talked about at the beginning of the year. We're not totally there yet, but it seems like we're getting closer and closer to it. And then our defense has remained a lockdown unit as we've hyped them up to be the entire year. So I think NIU, that game seems more and more like an outlier. And so for this, I think that we win this game handily. I think it's another boring game. I think it's another impressive final score for Notre Dame. I have us winning 42-13, so that has us beating the Vegas line pretty easily, and then also the SP plus line.
So Notre Dame is 7-2 against the spread this year. From a betting perspective, I think I've probably predicted Notre Dame is 8-1. So of course I got NIU wrong. Shame on me. But other than that, I've been really aggressive in Notre Dame against the spread. We've consistently been talking about SP Plus as Notre Dame being even better against opponents than Vegas does. And I think that gap is actually surging here in recent weeks where You know, they used to kind of be close, but even last week, that Vegas line opened up around 22 points, ballooned to 26 by kickoff. We said SP Plus would have implied about 27, 28. Kind of similar thing here. And against teams outside the top 50 in SP Plus, only Georgia Tech kept it inside of 18 points. And in that game, Notre Dame had all sorts of kind of just opportunities right there on offense and just kind of didn't put the game away when we could have, and kind of let Georgia Tech, I don't even want to say hang around, but just didn't really go full throttle beat down and pull away in that game. So we've blown out every opponent we've played that's outside the top 50 in SP Plus, of course, with NIU being the exception. So I've got Notre Dame winning this one in another comfortable blowout, 38-10, beating the Vegas line. I'm going to stay right on the SP Plus line and trust the analytics and go 38-10 in this one. So, Mike, let's get into our third segment, playoff picture. We've kind of put a couple of different areas where I'd say we've dug into the polls, we've dug into matchups coming up, and we've dug into the probably two most common right now predictors out there of who's going to make the SP Plus. That's ESPN's and The Athletics, home of Pete Sampson, who we always like shouting out on this show, one of our favorite Notre Dame beat writers. And, I think I'll cover this at a high level, and then maybe we can start getting into some of the polls and kind of where Notre Dame sits. But it's starting to put this perspective, this season into perspective. I think we should probably do a deep dive here in the next couple of weeks. But what was it, 2 weeks ago, we talked about how our defense might be one of the best 10 offensive or defensive units in Notre Dame over the last 40 years. Well, it's starting to get that way for the team as a whole. If you just look at where we are in SP Plus being in the top 10, that's happened probably 5 or so times going back to the early 90s and call it the post Lou Holtz era. Most recently in 2020 when we made the playoff during the COVID era. But we've never been this close to the number one team. And part of that is how much parity there is in college football right now, where there's not a Georgia or an Alabama or back in the 90s, Florida State or Nebraska, or in the early, 2000s and 2010s, like the Urban Meyer Florida dynasty. Like there's not some just juggernaut team that's just way better by everyone else. Like they're just 10 points better than the rest of the field. So Notre Dame right now is number 8th in SP Plus, and we would be about a touchdown underdog against Ohio State. So that doesn't mean it's a 50-50 toss-up, but everyone else between us and Ohio State, we'd be somewhere between a 0-point underdog and like a 3 to 4-point underdog. Like we are right there, contending with these teams if we'd be playing them on a neutral field. This is not like some of the other playoff games where you go into and you're like, gosh, I'm a 15-point underdog to Alabama. Like I don't have any business playing this game. I have a 20% shot to win. That's not going to be the scenario here. They might not be 50-50 games, but these are going to be 40-60 games in the first couple of rounds of the playoffs. And we're playing better of late. Like if you take the last 6 to 8 weeks of this season for Notre Dame, it's a totally different team as Dan Brock and Riley Leonard have really started to gel. So I mentioned we're 7-2 against the spread. That's a good sign. You're surging throughout the year where you're outperforming what people are expecting you to in the advanced analytics. And so, we can't pretend like NIU didn't happen, but if it didn't happen, Notre Dame would be number 2 right now behind Oregon. Like we are very squarely a top 10 team that is truly contending. We have one of the highest chances to make the playoffs in all of these prediction models. Like we're very clearly in the conversation. And this just isn't like Notre Dame making the playoff. This is Notre Dame making the playoff and a chance to go and win some football games. And that's really exciting. I don't think it's a place we've been in really over the last 30 years. Like you really got to go back to 93, 94, 95, where you could say Notre Dame is at this upper echelon of the sport. So, Mike, obviously we all know we're number 10 in the polls. As of last week, we moved up a few spots in the coaches and AP that came out today as we record this on Sunday. Won't know the new playoff polls until Tuesday, but walk us through kind of where this week shook up and where we're likely landing in the playoff polls come Tuesday night.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm just going to make a quick call out. Like as we were preparing this segment, we were using last week's SP Plus numbers. As we were recording, new SP Plus numbers came out, and you mentioned number 8. We're actually number 7 now. So we improved our ranking a bit. So it's a little bit, but just continues to show that we're doing really well with the advanced metrics. And then interestingly, ESPN FPI, which is another metric that you could look at, has us as number 4, which I think that would be pretty shocking to a lot of people. But it just again continued evidence that Notre Dame is playing at an extremely high level. But getting to your question in terms of what happened this week, because there were again this wasn't the most chaotic week that we've seen this year, but there was some chaos and there definitely were some implications for the playoff. I think one, I'm going to start with UGA here. So the question that I think a lot of people have is, does UGA getting blown out by Ole Miss, does that drop them below Notre Dame? So I think yes, I think it does. I think Georgia, if you look at it from an eye test standpoint, they haven't been particularly impressive this year. I think Carson Beck at times has been pretty ineffective. Their offense as a whole has stalled out in many instances. And then they've really had to fight to survive. They've had really close games against teams like Kentucky, Florida, Mississippi State. These are not good teams, and Georgia has not exactly put them away. So I think they were hanging on to their ranking previously just because they hadn't dropped any really bad games, and they had like the impressive win against Texas. But now that you have this data point of them losing, I think pretty handily to Ole Miss, I think it makes these other examples of the eye test not looking good for them. It just makes that seem more important. And I think when you put all that together, I think that they will drop below us. Now you never know. Again, they're an SEC team. They do have a very impressive win, but my guess is that they'll drop below us. And then on the other side of that game, Ole Miss, the question is, does Ole Miss jump Notre Dame? So if you look at Ole Miss's resume, this is one of their 2 ranked wins. So I think this game is a similar quality of victory as Texas A&M. This game was actually at Ole Miss, whereas we beat Texas A&M on the road. And maybe you'd say Georgia's probably, they're going to be ranked a little bit higher than Texas A&M. So maybe it's a bit of a wash overall. They're probably about even. I think that's fair to say. And then their next best win is South Carolina, who I would imagine is probably going to be ranked this week. They had another win. So I think similar to us, they have a couple top 25 wins, but then they have 2 losses, and their losses are to Kentucky and LSU. So the question is that going to be worse than our one loss to NIU? I've interestingly heard some pundits say that maybe one way you could think about Notre Dame this year is that the NIU loss, if you wanted to quantify what it actually means, maybe it's worth 1.5 losses. So that seems fair to me. And I think if you take that, if you take that assumption as fair, I think that's still better than 2 losses. And it's a bit of a toss up, but I think Notre Dame should stay in front of both Ole Miss and UGA. But again, this is one of those scenarios where we're having a debate about it. So this is how I'm thinking about it. This is how Brett's thinking about it. But the committee might feel differently about this. So these teams are close enough where you could make a case either way. I think one thing that definitely.
And by the way, since we started prepping this during the day, the AP poll and coaches poll have come out and has us above Ole Miss and Georgia. I think we were debating throughout the day, like, gosh, if Ole Miss is above us, Ole Miss and Georgia are probably both above us. The AP poll and coaches poll, though, have both said, like, no, 8-1 Notre Dame over again. Like, Ole Miss, like, I get Kentucky is not NIU. I'm not trying to make that comparison, but Kentucky's only win in the SEC is against Ole Miss. Like, that's a bad loss, too. It's not NIU. I'm not making that stretch. But, like, Ole Miss now has 2 losses. Their only win is against Georgia. Like, really big win. And that's similar to our Texas A&M. And they are not blowing out teams and winning the eye test like we are. So the AP poll and coaches poll also seem to be thinking what we're thinking. But, like, I think that's a very fair debate of that 2-loss SEC resume versus our 1-loss independent resume.
Definitely. So it seems like a lot of people agree with us, but the committee, that's the thing. The committee it can be unpredictable at times. There's a human element to this. So we don't know exactly how they're going to be reacting to the eye test and how they're going to weight all these things. Now, one team that I think should drop below us is Miami. And I feel more confident with this one. So 0 top 25 wins. Their best win is Louisville. And then after that, maybe Florida. They haven't had a great schedule. And they certainly are not winning the eye test. I think week in, week out, a theme with them has been that they're flirting with disaster. There are many games where they easily could have lost. People, I would say Miami haters would say that the ACC refs have bailed them out a few times. And I think in many cases, some of these criticisms aren't that crazy. And look, they did the exact same thing this week, and then it finally came back to bite them. So, and importantly here, they lost to a team that Notre Dame beat handily. So if you're looking for common opponents, this is something that favors Notre Dame. So I think again, they're not winning the eye test. They have a bad loss, no good wins. The committee tends to favor good wins over losses. So I think Notre Dame should jump Miami. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the AP poll had us jumping Miami as well. So I think this is one that seems safer. The one that, on the other hand, I feel like seems like more certain for to go the other way is Alabama. So Alabama blew out LSU. I thought LSU honestly was going to play better, especially at Death Valley. I was expecting LSU to put together a better performance, but I'm not going to harp on, I guess how therapeutic it could be watching Brian Kelly lose yet another big game. But I think Alabama is going to jump us here. I think they were right. They were right behind us in the college football playoff rankings last time, and then they had a really impressive win. So I think now they have three. Again, the committee tend to weight good wins more than anything else. They have three dominating wins now against UGA, LSU, and Mizzou. And maybe their stock's fallen off a little bit, but that's still an impressive
Still a
win.
ranked
And
team. Yeah.
yep. And then their losses are to Tennessee. Tennessee's a top 10 college football playoff team. Vandy was top 25. They lost, so they'll probably jump out of the top 25, but they're still a good team. So I think if you're trying to take the mindset of the committee, I think it's likely that they're gonna stack up resumes and right now put Bama ahead of Notre Dame. And I don't think that's crazy. I think Alabama has an impressive resume. I don't think we're far apart. I think you could definitely make a case for Notre Dame being ahead of them as well. But I would say my inclination here for sure is that I would expect Bama to jump us, even if you take the an approach that's so simple that like Bama was one spot before Notre Dame, and then they blew out a really good, what was on paper a top 15 team. So I think it shouldn't be a surprise to see Bama jump us.
Interestingly, both the AP poll and coaches poll kept Notre Dame above Bama. Although if you get into the AP voting, that is one of the closest kind of teams next to each other within the poll. So clearly the AP poll has Notre Dame edging it out, but very much viewed this as like could go either way. And I agree with you. I think the committee likely puts Bama ahead of Notre Dame. We'll get back to the kind of what should ND fans be watching for on Tuesday. Previewing that foreshadow, folks, this is the one to watch of is Notre Dame staying ahead of Bama at that spot.
Yep, and I always get nervous whenever there's a sort of like subjective rating criteria against SEC teams. I think it's just I think any college football fan who's not a fan of an SEC team is just going to be paranoid that the SEC team is going to win out in that scenario. But we'll see. And as a lot of people would say, that's rich coming from a Notre Dame fan, which historically has been one of the most favored programs historically. Yeah. So I think, and then another team I'm going to touch on here was. So I would imagine most of our listeners did not stay up to watch this game. I live on the West Coast, so it was a lot easier for me to stay up to watch this game. But BYU Utah, which was one of the crazier games I've seen, like certainly this year and probably ever. So BYU, I mean, I'm stunned that they actually won this game.
Did you hear the Utah athletic director?
I did, yeah.
The Utah athletic director never takes media appearances for our listeners, never takes media appearances, goes up to do an impromptu interview before the coach does at Utah, and takes no questions and just sounds off on how excited he was to join the Big 12 for Utah in their first season. And he's not anymore. Screw these guys. And the commissioner will be hearing from me. The refs completely lacked professionalism, and that was absurd. And then he stormed out of the room. It was one of the best athletic director. Normally you'll hear that from a coach, but the athletic director just sounding off after a big rivalry game was awesome. Fine is definitely coming his way, but it was great television.
His inner fan came out, and
I think
he forgot that he's a professional, and that's linked to his fandom. But it is, I don't know, it's funny because they're definitely going to get fined. We'll see. I mean, I'm going to guess he might end up regretting that, but it is kind of refreshing to see these a lot of times these athletic directors who seem very robotic most of the time to actually show like a human side as a fan. But
$40,000 fine as of 14 minutes ago. We're recording this at 6 p.m. Eastern time on Sunday, November 10th, and they just came out. They already fined him $40,000 for the comments.
Love it. But I mean, this game was wild, and this is a heated rivalry. I don't know. I live on the West Coast. I work with people who went to BYU and Utah, so this is something this is a rivalry that I've always been aware of it, but I think I've become more aware of how intense it is in recent years. The game was at Utah. It was, I think, the biggest crowd
in Utah history.
In Utah history, yeah. And BYU did not look good this game. And granted, Utah went totally cold in the second half. Like I don't think their offense put up any points, but their defense was really stifling BYU's offense the entire second half. And it was at the point where BYU had the ball, 4th and 10, and I think they were on like their own 5-yard line or something. ESPN, their probability predictor, said that Utah had a 99.7% chance of winning the game at that point in time. And this was when there was like, I don't know, like 50 seconds left or something like that. Well, they hike the ball. It looks like Utah stops them, but then they actually whistle it. They say the play didn't happen. BYU got a timeout off, and no one heard it because it was so loud. So then they have the timeout, go to the next play. Then it's 4th and 10 again. Then there's holding on Utah, which gives BYU a little life, and then they go down, march downfield, hit a field
A
goal as time
little life.
expires.
They sacked him like they'd have had the ball. It was 4th and 10,
Yeah,
sacked
the
them,
game was
game
over. Yeah,
over. And instead, it gives them not a little life, but just any chance. Like it was all of the opportunity. Yeah, it was crazy wild ending.
yeah. So obviously, yeah. I mean, look, I'm stunned that they actually won that game, but yeah. I mean, look, they're still undefeated, but they have 2 top 25 opponents even on their schedule. This is their 4th win by 6 points or less. So from an eye test standpoint, not very impressive. The advanced metrics agree. They're 22 in SP plus, which is far behind Notre Dame. So if you're actually like thinking about how good they are, they don't stack up exactly like I would say in the same group that Notre Dame falls into. But look, they're still undefeated, so I think that's something that's probably going to win out for now. And it doesn't. We'll get into it more later, but it doesn't. This one doesn't really like matter that much. I think in terms of like Notre Dame seeding at the end of the day. But still, it would be, I think, from like a vanity standpoint, like having Notre Dame just rank higher sooner rather than later would have been nice to see them go down.
Interestingly, we're one spot behind them in the AP poll, one spot ahead of them in the coaches poll. So again, I put this one with Alabama as kind of toss-ups where the committee could go. I think the undefeated resume probably stays ahead of Notre Dame, but it'll be close. And so when you boil that all together as the starting point to kind of go look at games the rest of the way. So Notre Dame was number 10. We've moved up to number 8 in the AP poll. We've moved up to number 7 in the coaches poll. And I think the range of outcomes is 7 to 11 in the playoff rankings, and could really see that going any way. If we, move ahead of Bama and BYU, that would be as high as number 7. If they view that 2-loss UGA and Ole Miss resume similar to Alabama's and better than our 1-loss resume, that could move us all the way back to number 11. So that's the range of outcomes. And then it's important to remember we will be jumped. So if BYU stays ahead of us, and actually then let's even say they lose next week. And so now BYU, the best team in the ACC, and Boise State are all behind us. 2 of those 3 teams, or 2 of those 3 conference champions, whoever it winds up being, will get the 3rd and 4th spot. And then one of them will, stay behind us theoretically, assuming we win out. And so where that leaves you is, whether or not BYU's ahead of us or not, if they're behind us, they're jumping us. Whether or not Miami's ahead of us or behind us, they're jumping us. Whether or not Boise State is behind us or not, like they're in that bucket where the 2 or 3 out of those best teams or best conference champions will jump us. That means depending on how much jumping there is, it's not Notre Dame getting to number 8. It's Notre Dame getting to number 7, maybe even needing to get to number 6 in the ranking. And then you'll be leapfrogged in the seeding by the conference champions getting buys, moving us back to number 8. The reason why we're so focused on number 8 is seeds number 5 through 8 in the seeding get the all-important home game. So let's get into that path or those scenarios. So, the way to break this down is, I think, really Big Ten and SEC. And so there's not a lot of action left. Indiana is the team most likely to fall. They play Ohio State on the road in 2 weeks. So now next week, Indiana's on a bye. ESPN gives Ohio State a 73% chance of winning. SP Plus thinks that Ohio State will be about a 14-point favorite at home. So Indiana, pretty big underdogs. And Notre Dame absolutely needs Ohio State to win that game. So if Ohio State loses, Indiana will be in the Big Ten title game against Oregon. But Ohio State, with a 1-loss resume and a win over Penn State, and their only losses to Indiana and Oregon, who would at that point be top 5 teams. So they would have a top 5 win and 2 top 5 losses and undefeated in resounding fashion everywhere else, that's probably a better resume than Notre Dame. If Ohio State beats Indiana, Indiana will be a one-loss team like Notre Dame, will almost certainly not have a top 25 win on their resume. Doesn't look like anyone else on Indiana's resume so far or who they're about to play is really even sniffing the top 25. We're tracking towards probably three, Texas A&M, Army, and Louisville, all trending towards staying in the top 25 over the next 3 weeks. And so I think we would for sure be a better resume than Indiana. So that's one team to fall. If you stay in the rest of the Big Ten, there's not much left. Oregon has 2 top 15 wins over Ohio State and Boise State. They have 2 pretty easy regular season games left against Wisconsin and Washington. Clear shot to the Big Ten title. I think even if they lose in the Big Ten title and are then a one-loss team like Notre Dame, but those just big marquee wins right now and what would be a much better loss than NIU, they'd stay above us. Penn State, the other team in front of us, they play Purdue, Minnesota, Maryland, and are probably not making the Big Ten title game, barring an upset. Again, their only loss to Ohio State likely keeps them ahead of Notre Dame. Although I think it's important to note, Penn State, not big time wins on their schedule. Like Illinois and USC are probably their 2 best wins. There's a pretty good shot that when all is said and done, Penn State might not have a top 25 win on their schedule either. Illinois currently not in the top 25 and really no one else sniffing around it on Penn State's schedule. So could Notre Dame, if we go and really whoop up on USC, could you make an argument that our resume is better than Penn State? Maybe, but I think right now, like the committee's pretty consistently got, Penn State several spots ahead of us. I think that's probably fair. So in the Big Ten side of things, it's really IU. That's our most likely chance to move up pending some much, much bigger upsets like, Penn State losing a game to Minnesota or Maryland. In the SEC, it's all about this Georgia-Tennessee game here this weekend. And I think who Notre Dame is rooting for depends on where the committee puts us right now. If we're, behind Georgia, I don't know if it really matters. If one of those teams loses, I think we jump them both. If we're in between them, I still don't really know if it matters. Let's say Notre Dame is 8 and Georgia's 11 and Tennessee is 6, like the AP poll has it. If Georgia wins, I think they jump Notre Dame and Tennessee falls behind. If Tennessee wins, I think they stay above Notre Dame and Georgia might even fall out of the playoff picture, but for sure stays behind Notre Dame. And so I think regardless in that scenario, I think Notre Dame is in a good spot to stay above one of those teams, behind one of those. I think Notre Dame still really wants Tennessee to win that game to push Georgia to a third loss for the scenario. We'll get there in a little bit where Notre Dame loses one more time. I think if Georgia beats Tennessee and therefore they're both 2-loss teams, if Notre Dame takes a second loss, we're on the outside looking in. But if Georgia falls to a 3-loss team, I think Notre Dame stays above them even as a 2-loss team and, might have a shot to hang on to that 11th or 12th spot. And so that one, kind of a toss-up. I don't know if it really matters. Texas A&M, that's another big matchup. I think if Texas A&M beats Texas, even if Notre Dame beat Texas A&M, Texas A&M's resume through the course of the year just looks better than ours with 2 losses. And I think there's a pretty good chance they jump up. Maybe they put Texas A&M behind Notre Dame. Maybe. If Texas, of course, beats Texas A&M will fall. Texas will stay above Notre Dame. Even if Texas then makes the SEC title game and loses that, I think a 2-loss Texas team losing in the SEC title game with their only losses to Georgia and A&M, I think that resume stays above Notre Dame. So I think in that game, Notre Dame is rooting for Texas A&M to beat Texas. That would be a pretty big upset. I think Texas has about a 77% chance to win that game. Texas's other games are against Kentucky and Arkansas. Okay to bad SEC teams. Unlikely anything else is there. Alabama, they have an 82% chance to run the rest of the table with games against Oklahoma, Mercer, and Auburn. Oklahoma, the toughest test there, but they're 1-5 in SEC play, so there's not much to read into there. Ole Miss, they only have Florida, Mississippi State left. Two of the four worst teams in the SEC, they've got an 80% chance to win out. So there's not a lot left in the SEC that really impacts us. The biggest thing then, so what's the takeaway? The biggest thing there is, where does the committee put Notre Dame in this ranking with one loss relative to those two-loss SEC teams of Bama, Ole Miss, and Georgia? Because if we are ahead of them right now, they don't have a lot of opportunity to play up. The one team that does is Georgia, but by necessity of Georgia moving up, Tennessee moves down. If Notre Dame wins out and looks fantastic against a 500 USC team, I don't know if that's going to be enough to jump us when they're playing, Oklahoma or Arkansas or Kentucky. And so from our ability to move up, it's kind of IU. That's about it that's left on the chips to fall, pending chaos and pending upsets. But those upsets could just as likely fall against Notre Dame's way. And so this ranking is really important to set the terms of, is Notre Dame in that 7 or 8 spot in the ranking this week? That likely will move us up to 6 or 7 and protect us for a home game. If the committee has us jumped by any combination of Bama, Ole Miss, or Georgia, and they are setting the facts on the table that they believe a 2-loss SEC team is better than a 1-loss Notre Dame, that spells trouble to try to get one of those top 8 spots. So, Mike, I just walked through a lot of scenarios. I think I boiled it down to, we're Ohio State fans against Indiana. We're hoping, but shouldn't be expecting, chaos in the SEC. And this is a really important playoff ranking for Notre Dame fans on Tuesday night.
Yep. Big time. I think it'll give us insight into how the committee is weighting the resumes of different teams. And as you mentioned, in some cases, for many of these teams, there's not, unless you have really unexpected chaos, the way things that are kind of established in this ranking are going to hold relatively for some of these teams as you move forward. So I think if we're viewed more similar to what the AP poll has, I think we're sitting pretty good in that scenario. So yeah, I mean, like I think as we talk through these cases, again, you can make debates between many of these teams to be ahead of others, behind others. So again, the committee can be unpredictable. I think one thing, this is a bit of a tangent, but one thing that I think is on my radar is, one other element that we're assuming here is that these conference championships are going to be viewed just as another data point. Well, Pete Sampson, actually, he had a tweet, I think it was like a week ago. It was a quote from a member of the college football playoff. And I think he was kind of insinuating that a number of the college football playoff committee members could be thinking this way. But the idea when we got into this structure was that these conference championships would be just another data point. If you win, you get the upside of potentially getting a bye. But if you lose, you share the risk of losing another game and having a bad data point. There are a couple of members who actually made comments that they may not actually view it that way. There was I forgot the name of the guy, but he made a comment like, I don't know if I should penalize a team that much for playing in a conference championship and losing. So if that happens, that's something that could work against us. So again, there's a human element to this. There's some unpredictable element with the committee. We're going to get more insight into how they're thinking about, I think how they're stacking up these resumes on Tuesday. But then there's still a lot of factors moving forward that we don't even know about. So I think, yeah, we're definitely rooting for Ohio State. We're definitely rooting for chaos. I think we want Penn State to just not look very impressive. Because I do think we have a case to be ranked higher than them. When they were ranked a couple spots ahead of us, honestly, I was a bit surprised. I thought that from my standpoint, I thought our resume was more comparable than maybe the committee seemed to view it. But I think if Penn State starts looking a little shakier, maybe we can kind of start to chip away, and that would be something that would be able to help us. But
we have better wins. They have a way better loss.
Yes. And so we'll see what ends up winning. Look, if both teams look impressive to close the season, I think, Penn State will
That's
will
a team, though. I mean, they look like they won these games, but I mean, they really got lucky on the road at USC, winning by 3. They looked terrible and only won by 7 against Bowling Green back in the second week of the year. They really struggled and pulled away late against Illinois 21-7. So, I mean, like, they haven't been dominating the eye test, but losing to Ohio State versus losing to NIU are two very, very different data points.
Yeah. So, but if you even want to hope of some sort of flip. You need them to not look impressive to close the season. And then we really need to destroy USC. We need to beat them very handily because then you have a common opponent. And then that's another thing that you could point to
Exactly.
maybe get them to change their mind. I don't know if they will, but that gives you at least a shot of maybe doing it. So we're talking about scenarios where we get a home playoff game. And I think one thing that's interesting here, Brett, is that some of the scenarios that make it more likely for us to get a home playoff game would actually make it a little, in some cases, could make it a little less likely if we get a loss that we're able to still get into the playoffs. So there's a little bit of a give and take here.
Absolutely.
There's a million moving pieces with this thing, but with that, I guess let's get to our next topic, which is if we have another loss, are we going to be able to get in? And we're going to assume that we're losing to USC in this scenario. And I think the headline
By the
here
way,
is
can we agree, just to level set, if we lose to UVA or Army, that's two really bad losses. Forget where Army is ranked in the polls. I think that will be looked at differently than, say,
yes,
losing one of these other times. I think if we lose in either of the next 2 weeks, we're out. For sure.
definitely, because that's two bad losses. I mean,
Two bad
again, you could,
losses.
yeah, I think like Army, right? You could be like you said, Brett, you could be like, oh, they're in the top 25, but realistically, I think most people are going to treat that as a worse loss than if we lost to USC.
So the real question is if we lose to USC, who is, not good by their record, 2-5 in the Big Ten, 4-5 overall, but their losses have been by 5, 1, 3, 7, and 3 points. They beat an LSU team for what that's worth. Like they've been really competitive, and the advanced metrics like them. They're a top, I think top 25, top 30 team in the SP plus, and so I get it. Record misleading might make that look like a worse loss, but the advanced metrics that the committee has available to them and they consider like would be a relatively okay loss, all things being considered. So in that scenario, I think is where we're talking about like, does Notre Dame still get in if we're 10-2?
Yeah, and yeah, Brett, you're right. They're number 23 in SP plus. So again, Notre Dame, like we would still be, as it stands right now, about 10-point favorites at USC on the road. So there is a gap, but this is the exact type of pesky USC team that you don't want to face at the end of the year because they're not necessarily getting all the credit for, I guess, for being as challenging a test as they actually are. Like you said, they've had a lot of close losses. So they're a team that's capable of playing competitive against good teams. They're capable of actually winning some of these games. But then when you look at the record, it's not very good. So you're basically not going to be getting as much credit for the task at hand. And then if you lose, then you get penalized. But I think we're assuming that the committee is going to be looking at all the metrics, and then they're not going to view this as such a bad loss that it knocks us out, which I think is totally fair. I think if we're just looking at just to kind of like level set here about like our odds of getting in if we lose. If we win, we already mentioned if we win, we're in. It's more a question of whether we get a home playoff game. If we lose this game, the athletics model seems to imply about a 75 to 80% chance if we lose one more game. So basically the athletic, I think they're more favorable than some other models, but they seem to think that we have a really good shot at still making it even if we lose. ESPN, they're not quite as favorable. They agree that if we win, we're in, but then only about a 30% chance to make it if we lose a game. So I think one other thing to keep in mind here, we hinted at a lot of this stuff, but there's quite a lot of carnage that's already happened behind us. And there's still some that could happen, but there aren't as many opportunities maybe now as there was before. I mean, SMU and Miami, that's one thing to look at. They're on a collision course. I think the ACC only being a one-team conference, that helps a lot. That was a big moment from this weekend. That's something that helps us in a two-loss scenario where we lose another game. I think, having said all that, we should kind of lay out the land of who these potential 10 to 15 teams are, the top 10 to 15 teams that are kind of in contention for these last playoff spots.
Let's say everything holds serve. Let's say, as expected, Georgia beats Tennessee. And so there's now another 2-loss SEC team, and Georgia's resume even looks better than it did. Let's say Texas beats Texas A&M, so our loss looks a little bit worse, and Texas A&M is 3-loss and is out. And let's say Miami beats SMU, so Miami is in, SMU has 2 losses, and our 2-loss resume would look better than them, so like SMU's kind of out. And any combination of Oregon or Ohio State or Indiana kind of all stay above us and are there. You'd be left with Oregon, Ohio State, Penn State, Indiana, all locks above us. You'd be left with BYU as a lock above us, assuming they win the Big 12 championship. You'd have the ACC champ as a lock above us, Boise State as a lock above us for winning, being the fifth conference champion. And then that's 7 teams. So is Notre Dame in over one of Texas, Alabama, Ole Miss, Georgia, Tennessee? Is Notre Dame in over one of those two-loss SEC teams? Or fewer, in the case of Texas. And two of them are obviously, in that scenario, playing for an SEC title game with another data point. I don't think we're better than a two-loss SEC team. So I think in that scenario, if we're a two-loss team, so in that scenario, counting to 12, you need to get Ole Miss to stumble against a Mississippi State. You need Tennessee to beat Georgia. I think this is where, for us to get a bye, or sorry, for us to get a home game, I actually think we maybe want Georgia to beat Tennessee. I think to get in, we want Tennessee to eliminate Georgia with a third loss. Can we get Alabama to, stumble in a game here down the stretch? Like, you're going to need a little more chaos for Notre Dame to stay in. That's where I'm just not as bullish as the Athletic. I think they're just kind of assuming, look, are you really going to put 5 SEC teams in and 4 Big Ten teams in? I think yes, over a 2-loss Notre Dame, especially with the NIU data point. And that's not to mention some other chaos that can go against us. If Colorado or Kansas State go on to win the Big 12 and beat BYU in their title game, they would automatically get a spot as a conference champion. But I think a 1-loss BYU team maybe stays in over a 2-loss Notre Dame. I mean, that 1-loss BYU team now has very, very not good data points in terms of top 25 wins and doesn't have the benefit of being undefeated. But a 1-loss BYU team whose only losses in their conference championship, is the committee really going to ding them for playing that 13th game? And so then if the Big 12 gets 2 teams, now that's even one less spot for Notre Dame. So could Notre Dame get in? I'm more in the SEC, in the ESPN model bucket of, yeah, if Notre Dame looks really good against USC and loses a nail biter classic and we're 10-2, could we get in? Yeah, but I think 30% is probably a pretty good number to put on it, like ESPN does. And I think that 30% scenario is Tennessee beating Georgia about 30% of the time, or a massive upset with Bama or Ole Miss, or somewhere else along the way, like Indiana stumbling in another game and not just taking one loss to Ohio State but also losing to Purdue. Like, that's not happening. Or Penn State losing to Minnesota. But even then, like a 2-loss Penn State team against a 2-loss Notre Dame team, like, I don't know, that's a 50-50. So there is a scenario for Notre Dame to lose to USC, but it is a very, very tough path. The Athletic thinks we still get in most of the time. I think they think, just look, out of all of those games, there's got to be a little bit more chaos in the next 3 weeks. ESPN's model says, I think all that chaos kind of neutralizes. Like, if someone moves down, someone else is moving up. And it leaves me to believe like Notre Dame fans should still be thinking like, we got to win out. This is we got to win out mindset. I think we've been in that mindset since the 3rd week of the season now. I just don't see a path to us losing a game here and be able to move up. Not to mention recency matters. Like, if you'd have told me you lose to Louisville or lost one earlier and you're surging at the end, it's maybe a different story. But I just don't see a scenario where we're a 2-loss team and can not drop out of the top 12 at this point.
I agree. I think you just in terms of like the differences in these models, I think you summarized exactly what are the key differences in terms of what they're assuming. And yeah, I tend to agree that, I mean, look, we'll get more information like just from how the committee is going to think about different resumes on Tuesday. But I do tend to think that as it relates to the SEC, a lot of this chaos just does tend to offset. And it's like, oh, hey, okay, this team beat this team, but guess what? Like, now this team looks more impressive. So that loss is actually to not as bad a team as we thought. So it kind of hedges itself a little bit. We'll see. Maybe we could be wrong, but I would say from my experience watching these ranking processes in the past, that does tend to seem like how it works for the most part, specifically as it
Absolutely.
relates to for the SEC especially.
So it's our job to look ahead as Notre Dame fans. It's Marcus Freeman and the team's job to go focus on this week. But, I think of all of the playoff rankings, a lot of them now are going to start to just be like, look, if you win, you move up. If you lose, you move down. But like, there's not going to be a ton of reevaluation. And this feels like a really important ranking here on Tuesday. But first things first, Notre Dame's got to go control their own destiny, take care of business, win, and you're in. Until next week, Gyrish beat Cavaliers.
Garish, be Cavaliers.